We used to do a lot more activities here and invite more student groups and others in. The challenge became we were loving it to death.
Mr. Frederick Weyerhaeuser. It was from his immigration to America that Frederick would go on to form a company with his brother-in-law, Frederick Dankman.
Their business boomed. It's not an overstatement to say that Frederick Weyerhaeuser was one of the wealthiest persons in the world, not just the United States. In fact, there was a phrase that was coined to describe people like him, lumber barons.
The Weyerhaeusers originally lived in Coal Valley, about 15 minutes away from Dankman's family. Everything seemed to be peaceful for a short time until an unforeseen threat emerged in 1869.
There was a lot of disease going around in the town, typhus and cholera and these kinds of things, and they had 7 small children. And children were particularly vulnerable to these kinds of diseases, so they thought that by moving to a more secluded area, which this was, that they would have, their children would have a better chance and more fresh air. So they got this house and the surrounding 26 acres in 1869.
The Weyerhaeusers prospered, modifying and cultivating the farmhouse that they had bought into a 3-story mansion over the course of the next decade. However, Frederick had moved from Rock Island, not just because of Dankman's passing, but also due to the movement of the lumber company. You see, much of their lumber came from Wisconsin, which during the company's previous years allowed them to be incredibly successful.
They moved their operations upstream, and for a while the Rock Island Company was headquartered in St. Paul, Minnesota, and most of the family moved there. And then in the 20th century, after they had exhausted most of the first cut timber, they set their sights on the Pacific Northwest. So today, Weyerhaeuser International is headquartered in a suburb of Seattle. It's out there. And they are a global leader in sustainable forestry. So they learned that you can't just cut the forest and then move on. They now develop forests that will be producing timber products for generations to come.
They lived in the house for about 75 years. The last family member who lived here was Apollonia Weyerhaeuser and her husband Sam Davis. They lived here until about the 50s.
And they had a child named Edwin. And by the time Apollonia died in 1953 here in the house, Edwin put out the word to the whole extended family saying, look, nobody from the family wants to live in Rock Island anymore because we don't have business interests there. So he said, is it okay if we just donate it to that college? And the family voted to do so.
With 2 conditions: that we maintain the first floor, much as it was when the family lived here, and that we not call it the Weyerhaeuser Mansion. They wanted it called House on the Hill, and so the college has actually done those things.
House on the Hill continues to be just a treasure for the campus. Not many schools have a place as special and as historic as this, with as many stories swirling around it. It's great that when the family gave it to us, they expected it to be used. Again, usefulness is a theme of the Weyerhaeusers throughout. Initially, we housed faculty here because the college was growing very, very rapidly in the 40s and 50s after World War II. And then the shift came a little bit later in the 50s and into the 60s. It was all students. And primarily, initially, it was women students who were allowed to live in the upper floors. And then these main floors are more sort of museum grade. We've had to kind of limit the amount of use of the building over time, especially the dining room, which is so extraordinary, so that we don't love it to death. But we do love to tell the story, and when the circumstances are right, to get students and employees in here to learn more about the house.
Many stories are similar to each other, but each person's experience has been different. A lot of these stories would just seem to be something wrong with the house, but as we have looked at the history of the house and the family, the stories start to make sense. There have been a couple more recent stories that some of the students who currently live here or have lived here in the past both share about doors locking and being unlocked when they should not be.
One day I would walk into my apartment and it'd be like cracked, and then I told my, no, it was like black, it was pitch black in there. And so I told my boss in facilities, and I was like, hey, there's something going on? Like, did someone go in there? She was like, no, there's no reason that someone should be in there. I'll go send up a custodian to lock it. And then a couple days would go by and it would be open again. And I was like, hey, did someone ever lock that? And she was like, yeah, someone went up there and locked it.
I actually, just recently, this week, I was coming in just from, end of class, and I saw it, actually the door right next to the stairs. The stairwell was open, and it was actually the first time I'd ever seen the inside of it. I looked, there was no one in it. I didn't know if anyone was preparing an event at all or some kind of tour, but I just kind of acknowledged that that was an open door. I went upstairs to my room. I didn't really think about it at all.
Other examples are that students have reported that a door will be locked, like that shouldn't be, like a closet or something else like that, and they'll call facilities, and then when they come back, the door is standing open.
I'm sure that you saw the tower in the top front of the building. That actually, when the Weyerhaeuser family lived here, housed a tank of water. This was one of the first houses with running water in Rock Island. And the way the water got up there is Mr. Weyerhaeuser believed in the power of hard work. The sons had to go down into the basement and pump a pump to drive the water up into the tank up there. And so it was hard work, and it was dusty and dirty down in the basement. They didn't particularly care for the job, but it was their job. Sisters, as sisters will do, loved to turn on the taps so that that would drain the tank, meaning their brothers had to go back down and pump it up again. So some of the stories I've heard are about water turning on unexplained. If somebody will be gone for the day, they'll come home and find their shower running at full blast.
I was giving a tour, and a woman who had lived here in the, maybe about 20 years ago, after I told all these stories, said, "Oh, now that explains it." And she told me later, she said there were several times when she would leave for class, right, and then come back, and the bathtub was filled to within a couple of inches below the overflow valve, right? Now, if you leave a tub on, it's going to have this valve that lets it drain without spilling out all over the floor, right? That's been the case for a long, long time. But she thought it was amazing that the water would fill up to about 3 inches below, and then there was no water dripping, no anything else like that at all.
The event that happened in House on the Hill occurred in the early 90s. I was working one summer night. There were no students living here. There were no students on campus, and the house was empty. I drove by and saw a light on the second floor. So I stopped and I entered this house, and I went up to the second floor to find the light that was on. So I turned the light off, and as I turned around, I heard footsteps coming down the stairs. And at that time, there was a rocking chair that was sitting in the corner at the bottom of the stairs. And when I got down to the bottom, the rocking chair was going back and forth, and there was no one in this house except me.
My only personal experience was one night we were doing stories in the house, and it was getting a little bit late, and we take very good care to make sure everything is locked up. We don't want anything to happen to anything that's in the house now. So the last lights that I turn off are the lights in the dining room, these sconce lights that come up, and I turn them off one at a time. And as I go, sometimes just for my own benefit, I think about all of the music that the kids studied here, and so I'll whistle something. It might be a little Mozart, or I usually like to whistle a little Bach, like some of the stuff from his cantatas. And I was whistling from one of those, and I get to the last light, and I'm turning it off, and a moth just flew right past my ear. I just felt it, the wings of a moth feel like, and it just kind of went by. So I clicked the light back on, there was no moth. So I like to think that maybe for sharing the stories and the spirit of care and hospitality, that maybe I got a kiss from Apollonia.